They say the forest keeps its secrets, but that night, the pines whispered of something left behind. Not a ghost, not a man, but a cry that pierced through the snow. And when John Whitaker followed the sound, he didn't find wolves or hunters. He found 2 German shepherds chained to a tree, abandoned, silent, and watching him like they already knew his story. This is the Ashwood Pact, chained, found, and freed. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us, where are you listening from? The woods? Your kitchen? Somewhere far from the snow of Ashwood? Drop your location in the comments. We'd love to know where this story finds you. It happened just outside the quiet mountain town of Millersville, Colorado, where winter bites hard and silence carries weight. John Whitaker, a man hardened by loss and long years of isolation, was never meant to be out that night. He was searching for a stubborn mule. Instead, he found something far more unexpected: 2 wounded lives tethered to a tree in the woods. And what followed would rewrite everything he thought he knew about redemption and about family. Ashwood, Colorado, lay tucked between snow-dusted ridgelines, the kind of place that didn't exist on postcards or travel guides. In late November, the cold came early and mean-knifing through layers, freezing breath mid-air, and making the evergreens creak like bones under strain. John Whitaker had lived here for 7 years, alone since the accident, in a cabin he'd built with his own hands and grief. He was 52, broad-shouldered with a wiry frame hardened by decades of hunting and homesteading. His face bore the quiet weight of loss lying deep at the corners, gray in the beard, and with a permanent tightness around the eyes. His hair, once black, now faded into a stormy salt and pepper that matched the skies. John wasn't known in town for warmth. Folks in Millersville, about 30 miles down the mountain, saw him as a ghost with boots on. He kept to himself, spoke little, and carried the kind of sorrow that didn't want fixing. His wife, Maggie, and their teenage boy, Will, had died in a fire while John was away on a hunting trip. He never forgave himself. Never would. That morning, he'd gone out searching for Mabel, the stubborn old mule who had once again broken her tether. The sun hadn't risen yet, and snow from the night before still whispered across the forest floor in thin, restless layers. As he passed Widow's Hollow, a ravine known for its bone-chilling wind, she heard something unnatural, a sound not made by beast or storm. It was a whimper. Low, ragged, desperate. John stopped, listened again. Another cry closer. He tied his coat tighter and descended the slope, stepping carefully through brush and frost until he reached a clearing below an old cedar tree, scarred by lightning and time, and there he saw them. 2 dogs. German shepherds, both full-grown but still young, likely under 2 years old. Their coats were a shared dusky sable, dulled by grime and crusted blood. The one on the left was alert, ears pricked, yet frozen in place with its head held low and tail tucked. The other lay slumped against the tree, ribs heaving slow, eyes half closed. Both were bound to the tree by thick iron chains looped cruelly around their necks. The links had rusted into the bark, suggesting this wasn't done hours ago but days. John's breath caught in his throat. He took a cautious step forward. The alert one growled softly low, unconvincing, like it had once known how but forgotten. John crouched slowly, voice gravel and calm. "You're all right now," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you." The standing dog shifted slightly, eyes watching his every move. John pulled out his old skinning knife, still sharp as giltend, worked the chain loose where it was wedged behind a knot in the cedar. It took a few hard strikes to sever the weakest link, and when the final snap came, the upright dog flinched backward, dragging the other a few inches in reflex. He dropped the knife, raised his hand slowly. "No one's going to chain you again." There was something in the eyes of the alert one, intelligence, pain, caution, threaded with something deeper. Not feral, not stray. These dogs had known people once, known loyalty, known betrayal. He cut the second dog free more gently, wrapping a hand around its chest to steady its weight. Its body was warm but barely, fevered. "All right," John muttered. "Let's get you out of here." He wrapped both dogs in his hunting blanket, hefted the limp one into his arms, and whistled for Mabel, who had wandered nearby munching icicle grass like nothing was amiss. With effort, he secured both dogs across the mule's pack saddle and began the slow walk home. The alert, one still quiet, still wary, never took its eyes off him. Back at the cabin, he laid them near the wood stove on a bed of old flannel shirts and quilt scraps. He boiled water, poured broth over stale cornbread, and slid the bowl toward them. The stronger one sniffed, but didn't eat. The weaker one stirred briefly when the heat from the fire touched its side. John sat down across from them, rubbing the ache in his knees. "You're not mine," he said softly, "but maybe I'm yours for a while." He had no intention of keeping them. He told himself that. Tomorrow, he'd drive into Millersville, call the shelter, do his duty. But then the stronger one, still nameless, shifted slightly and locked eyes with him again. Something in that look reached into a part of him he thought had long since turned to ash. He looked away first. The fire had burned low by morning, casting a dull orange glow over the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving behind a heavy silence, and snow piled thick against the windowsills. John Whitaker stood by the stove, stirring oatmeal in a dented old pot, glancing every so often at the two German shepherds curled near the hearth. They hadn't moved much in the night, but both were still breathing steady now, no longer the shallow, panicked gasps of the night before. The stronger of the two had watched John through half-lidded eyes as he checked them over. No collar, no tags, no sign of ownership. Just bruises, frost-bitten paws, and something elsey, strange, uneasy stillness in their bones, like they were waiting for the next strike to fall. That one would need a name, so would the other. He hadn't named a dog in years, not since Duke died in the fire with Maggie and Will. But these two weren't going anywhere, not today at least. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Blitz," he said aloud, pointing at the more alert one, the one who had growled softly but didn't bite. The name fit sharp, fast, ready. Blitz lifted his head slightly at the sound, ears twitching. "And you?" he continued, looking at the other dog whose eyes remained shut, chest rising slow. Echo. It felt right. Fainter, quieter, but still there. Always there. John crouched beside them. "Blitz and Echo," he repeated. "Guess you're mine now, huh?" Neither dog moved. But Blitz's eyes stayed fixed on him, and for a second, John thought he saw something flicker behind them, recognition, maybe, or memory. Later that day, he carried Echo, still too weak to walk to the shed out back where he kept his old veterinary supplies from the years Maggie used to foster strays. He cleaned their wounds gently, wrapping Echo's front leg where the chain had rubbed raw. Blitz remained by the cabin door, silent, watching. When John approached him with the kit, Blitz stood but didn't retreat. That trust alone made John pause. He knelt and began cleaning a gash along Blitz's shoulder. That's when he saw it. Just beneath the thick fur, hidden by dirt and scar tissue, was a burn mark raised slightly, twisted into shape like someone had seared it with intent. It was a circular brand, no larger than a silver dollar, depicting the head of a snarling wolf surrounded by curling flames. John froze, breath locked in his throat. He hadn't seen that mark in years. Not since the Forest Service raided a compound just outside Dawes, a dogfighting ring disguised as a training camp. He remembered the dogs, the cages, the blood. He backed away slowly, heart pounding. The last time he'd seen that symbol, his son Will had been alive barely 20, working with wildlife enforcement, burning with that kind of young fire John had once carried. Will had gone undercover to investigate the ring. A month later, his body was found in a burned-out trailer up north, throat crushed, the mark of the wolf scorched into the doorframe. No one had ever been arrested. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses vanished. The case faded. Until now, John sat on the edge of the porch, the mountain air sharp in his lungs. He looked at Blitz, who now lay at the threshold, alert but calm. "Where did you come from?" he whispered. Blitz didn't answer, but something in his eyes said, "Farther than you think." The next day, John drove his old Ford into Millersville. He didn't want to, but supplies were low, and Echo needed better antibiotics than what he had left from years ago. The town was quiet as usual, just a few pickups parked outside Redmond's general store, smoke rising from chimneys, and the sharp clang of the blacksmith's hammer ringing down from the far end of Main Street. He tied the dogs in the back of the truck, both wrapped in blankets. Blitz sat upright, stoic, while Echo remained curled, eyes closed but no longer shivering. Inside the store, he nodded to Laura Redmond, the owner's daughter. Laura was in her mid-30s, tall and wiry, her strawberry blonde hair always tucked under a ball cap. She'd known John since before the fire, used to babysit Will when she was in high school. "Those your dogs?" she asked without looking up, scanning cans across the counter. "Found them in the woods," John said simply. "Chained up." She paused. "Chained?" He nodded. "Same mark from that old cased house." Laura's hand stilled on the scanner. "John," her voice dropped. "You sure?" He looked her in the eye. "I don't forget that kind of thing." She glanced toward the truck through the frost-covered window. "If that's true, someone dangerous put them there. You gonna report it?" John shook his head. "Not yet." "Why not?" He hesitated. "Because if someone's branding dogs again, it ain't random. And if it ain't random, maybe it's coming back around." Laura's face hardened, but she said nothing more, just rang him up and tossed in a small pack of jerky without charging him. "For them," she said, "and for Will." Back home, John gave the jerky to Blitz and crushed half a painkiller into Echo's broth. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the fire, rifle resting across his lap, eyes on the dark outside the window. Snow had started again, falling slow and soft. Echo stirred beside the hearth, letting out a soft sigh. Blitz lay beside him, one ear always turned toward the door. They weren't just dogs, not anymore. They were keys to something bigger, and John knew the lock. The snow had stopped, but the cold lingered like an old scarron of those aches that settled in your bones and whispered memories you'd rather forget. John Whitaker had spent the better part of the day splitting wood behind the cabin, while Blitz lay nearby, eyes always scanning the trees. Echo had begun walking on his own again, still stiff, still slow, but stronger than the shivering pup John had found chained to a cedar days earlier. John hadn't spoken much since returning from town, but the weight in his chest had changed. The mark on Blitz's shoulder wasn't just a memory, no, it was a warning. A relic from a past he thought buried in ashes along with his son's bones. As dusk settled over the pines, painting the snow in bruised hues of purple and rust, John heard something snap in the woods too crisp to be wind, too slow to be falling branches. He reached for the Winchester leaning against the porch rail and stepped down into the fresh frost, motioning Blitz to stay. He circled the property carefully. The woods were quiet, too quiet. When he reached the back of the house, where his tool shed stood half sunk into the hillside, he noticed the door ajar. It had been latched shut that morning. He moved closer, careful, boots silent over the crusted snow. The door creaked on its hinges as he nudged it open. Inside, it was dark, but the moonlight leaking through the slats showed a mess. Cans overturned, an axe missing, drawers yanked open like someone had been searching for something specific. Then he saw it, a trail of red leading from the shed to the fence, line small drops at first, then more smeared, like someone had been dragging a wounded limb. John followed it to the back gate, where something hung from the top rung. A bone. Long, clean, fresh. Tied with a frayed piece of leather cord and hanging by a nail swaying gently in the wind. John stared at it for a moment, jaw tightening. He didn't need to guess what it meant. That was a calling card, same as always. Only one man ever used that sign. Victor Cade. Back when John was a forest ranger in his late 30s, Victor had been a name whispered in bars and kennels across Colorado, a ghost in the underground world of dogfighting. Charismatic, cruel, and always 2 steps ahead of the law, Victor didn't just train dogs to kill. He branded them, broke them, turned them into shadows of themselves. Will had been the one to dig too deep. John stepped back from the gate, breathing hard, his grip tightening on the rifle. Victor had vanished years ago after the raid up in Taos. Some said he was dead. Others swore he fled south into Mexico. But John had always suspected he'd resurface. And now, Blitz and Echo were the proof. They weren't lost strays, they were escape-a-survivors. And Victor wasn't done with them. That night, John didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, rifle across his knees, both dogs close to him. Blitz paced occasionally, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the windows. Echo lay curled near the stove, but even he didn't rest easy. Something in the cabin had shifted. Safety, once fragile but real, had begun to crack. In the morning, John drove back into town. Sheriff Clay Denton was outside the station, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. He was in his early 60s, barrel-chested, with silver hair that clung stubbornly to the sides of his head, and a mustache thick enough to hide a week's worth of attitude. Clay and John had known each other for 30 years, fished together before Maggie died, drank together after. But the sheriff had long since learned John didn't bring trouble unless it found him first. "You look like hell," Clay said. "I think it's coming back," John replied. Clay narrowed his eyes. "What is?" John handed him the scrap of leather and the bone. "Victor Cade." Clay stared at it, then looked up. "You sure?" "I found it hanging on my fence last night. Shed's been ransacked, someone's bleeding, and Blitz." John glanced at the truck. "He's marked with the same brand from the Cade fights." Clay exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I thought he was gone. Guess we were wrong." Clay leaned in. "You want me to send a deputy out?" "No," John said. "I don't want a badge spooking him. He knows these woods better than most of your boys do." Clay gave him a long look. "Then what are you planning?" "Waiting," John said. "But not unarmed." He picked up supplies and headed home by mid-afternoon. When he reached the cabin, Blitz met him at the gate, stiff, alert. Echo lay in the snow beside the porch, head on his paws, watching the tree line. John unloaded the truck, stepped inside, and stopped. The living room window had been cracked open from the outside. On the floor lay a brass tag, cold to the touch, stamped with just one letter, V. He stared at it for a long time before picking it up. He knew what it meant. Victor didn't just want the dogs back. He wanted John to know he was coming for them. The cold came hard that morning, sharper, deeper. It wasn't just the weather. It was the kind of cold that crept beneath doors, that settled in your chest like a bad omen. John Whitaker felt it in his bones. When he stepped out onto the porch, coffee steaming in his hand, rifle propped nearby. The sky was overcast, leaden and low, and the forest around his cabin was too still. Blitz stood by the woodpile, his breath visible, ears up. Echo was by the porch stairs, tail low but eyes alert. Something was coming. By noon, John had finished reinforcing the windows with timber planks salvaged from the old barn. He'd wired a bell to the fence Gitaea, crude but reliable early warning system, and placed his backup rifle above the mantel. He didn't know when Victor would make a move, but he knew it would be soon. The brass tag with the letter V now hung by a nail above the door, not as a warning, but as a vow. It was just past sundown when Blitz let out the first bark. Not a call, not curiosity. A deep, echoing roar that cut through the pines like a gunshot. John dropped the kettle, grabbed his rifle, and moved fast. He reached the front of the cabin as two figures emerged from the trees, flanking a third. All three moved with a purpose military precision in their steps. The man in the center was tall, dressed in a long dark coat with a fur collar, his boots polished despite the mud. He wore a black Stetson pulled low, shadowing his face. Victor Cade. Even after all these years, he hadn't aged like most men. Still lean, still clean-shaven, with silver hair slicked back and a cruel, measured gait. But his eyes blue like cracked ice were what John remembered most. Calculating. Empty. The two men beside him were rougher. One was broad and tattooed across the neck, maybe 40, with a crooked jaw and small, twitching eyes. The other was younger, redhead, gaunt, maybe early 20s, but with a rifle that looked like it'd seen more blood than years. John stepped forward, rifle in hand, Blitz pressed to his side. "You've got 5 seconds to turn around." Victor smiled, slow and deliberate. "Hello, John. Thought we'd come visit. Your hospitality's famous. You don't get to joke after what you did to my son." Victor's expression didn't change. That boy walked into a world he didn't understand. John raised the rifle slightly. He understood enough to see what you were. Victor looked past him, toward the cabin. "Where are they? You lost them the second you left them chained to a tree like trash." "They're mine," Victor said, voice cold. "Marked, paid for." "They're not property," John growled. "They're mine now." The larger of the two henchmen shifted, raising his weapon. Blitz snarled, and in a blur of motion, Echo silent until now burst from the porch. He launched himself at the bigger man's leg, teeth clamping down hard. The man screamed, lost balance, and fired wildly into the snow. John took the shot. The younger man dropped instantly, bullet through the shoulder. Victor ducked behind a tree as Blitz lunged at the larger man, forcing him down. John moved, fast and low, firing again into the tree line. Victor shouted something unintelligible as Echo released and backed toward John, bleeding from a graze near the ribs but upright. A second shot rang out. John felt it slice across his left arm, not deep but hot, sharp. He grunted, dropped behind a log, reloaded with teeth clenched against the pain. "You always knew how to make things personal," Victor called from the woods. "You made it personal the moment you touched my son." A pause. Then, "That was never about you." John stood, rifle aimed. "It is now." He fired again. The bullet shattered bark inches from Victor's hat, and a moment later, the sound of retreating footsteps echoed through the trees. Victor's silhouette vanished beyond the ridge, the larger man stumbling after him, leaving behind a trail of blood that stained the snow like rust. John stood still for a moment, heart hammering, the cold burning through the open tear in his sleeve. Blitz padded to his side, fur dusted with snow. Echo limped toward him, tail wagging faintly, tongue lolling despite the wound. John dropped to one knee, pulled Echo close, and let out a long, shaking breath. "You came for me," he whispered. Echo pressed his head into John's chest. Snow still blanketed Ashwood, soft and undisturbed, except for the tracks leading around John Whitaker's cabin prints from boots, paws, and the slow drag of a wounded arm. The aftermath of the confrontation had settled into the bones of the forest like a bruise. Yet the air that morning didn't carry dread. It carried resolve. John stood at the fence line with hammer in hand, sweat misting off his brow despite the cold. The post he'd just finished driving into the frozen ground stood straighter than the old one, reinforced with steel bands he'd salvaged from the collapsed barn. The perimeter would hold this time and ought just to keep danger out, but to give the dogs inside something they'd never had, safety. Blitz lay a few yards away, still and focused, watching every move. His alert posture had become second nature, a soldier at rest but never asleep. Echo, bandaged but healing, dozed in the sun by the porch. His tail flicked now and then at the wind or passing crows, but his body had regained strength. His eyes no longer flinched when John approached. Inside the cabin, the walls had changed. The cracked glass window was replaced with new panes from a stash John had forgotten he owned. The back door now had a crossbar lock. Hooks had been mounted by the fireplace for 2 leashes, and a drawer by the kitchen held treats instead of bullets. In the early afternoons, John began working with the dog's short hand signals, low whistles, routines he hadn't used in years. Back when he served in the Corps, he'd trained patrol canines for quiet infiltration. Blitz picked up fast, eager, and sharp. Echo took more time, but his loyalty was unwavering, and when the moment clicked, when Echo followed the stay low signal and dropped perfectly into place, John had smiled without realizing it. "You remember more than they took from you," he'd whispered to him, kneeling in the frost. On the 4th day after the attack, Sheriff Clay Denton came by again. He stood on the porch, hands in his jacket pockets, mustache lined with frost, looking more tired than usual. "You really planning to keep them?" Clay asked, glancing at Blitz, who watched him from behind the stacked firewood. John didn't answer right away. He poured 2 mugs of black coffee and handed one over. Then he nodded. "They saved me." Clay raised a brow. "Most folks say the other way around. Doesn't feel that way." Clay stared out over the clearing. "People in town talk, you know. Said you were different. Since Will died, that you stopped being reachable." John didn't flinch. "They weren't wrong." Clay hesitated. "I've seen what a second chance looks like. This feels like one." He patted his thigh, nodding toward the dogs. "Just be careful. Cade won't be gone for good." "I know," John said. "But next time, I won't wait." Later that day, something remarkable happened. A blue pickup pulled up the long dirt road. John stepped outside, wary, hand brushing the grip of his rifle. But it wasn't trouble. It was Sarah Bell, the grocer's widow. She was in her late 60s, tall and angular, with snow-white hair always tied in a neat bun and lips that rarely curved up. Known for her stiff manners and colder glances, Sarah had been alone since her husband died during the blizzard of '98. She hadn't spoken more than 5 words to John in a decade. She stepped out holding a basket. "Pork stew, still warm. You'll need it." John blinked. "Why?" "You have mouths to feed now, and I heard about what you did, about the dogs." He accepted the basket. "Thank you." She didn't smile, but she held his gaze. "They remind me of someone." "Who?" "My son. Used to train shepherds for SAR teams in Kansas before he died. Car crash. No one came to his funeral but me and the dogs he saved." She looked past John, at Blitz and Co. "Some lives don't get monuments, but they still save people." She turned and walked back to her truck. By the end of the week, more visitors came. Small gestures, a sack of flour, a pair of blankets, a wood-carved bowl. No one stayed long, and no one asked questions, but each left something behind, proof that the town had noticed, that whatever John had become, he was changing again. That evening, as the wind howled over the ridge and frost began creeping back along the windows, John sat by the fire with a notebook in his lap. A fire crackled beside him, its warmth reaching deep. Echo rested his head on John's foot, sighing softly. Blitz lay curled in front of the hearth, eyes half shut, ears relaxed for the first time. John opened the notebook, its cover dusty, pages blank. The last time he'd written anything personal was before the funeral. Now, he wrote, "I thought I'd buried the best parts of myself in the same dirt that took my family. But somehow, these 2 creatures pulled me back. Not with words, but with presence, with silence, with loyalty I didn't deserve." He paused, looked down at Echo. "I'm not alone anymore." Not all saviors speak. Some come wrapped in fur, bearing silent scars and unmatched loyalty. Blitz and Echo were more than just abandoned dogs. They were survivors who taught John Whitaker that healing doesn't always begin with words, but with presence, trust, and the quiet courage to stay. He believed he'd buried every reason to live alongside his family, but in protecting them, he found pieces of himself he thought long dead. Life can be cruel, but love especially, the kind that asks for nothing, can stitch even the most shattered soul back together. And sometimes, it's not we who rescue them, it's they who rescue us. If you've ever been loved by an animal, even just a wag of the tail or a silent, steady gaze, hold on to that moment. It matters. Share this story if it reminded you of a dog, a friend, or a time you were pulled from the edge by something small but mighty. And if you can, open your heart to those still waiting in shelters or on the streets. Comment: who rescued who? Share this story to remind someone that redemption comes in all forms. 7 four-legged.